You don't even know their last name. You've had maybe 4 conversations, 2 of them over text, one that was just a reaction to your story, one that lasted longer than you expected, and ended before you were ready. That's the whole inventory. That's everything you actually have. And yet somehow they've taken up permanent residence in your head. You're replaying the long conversation looking for what it meant. You're checking whether they've posted anything since you last looked 20 minutes ago. You've already imagined 3 different versions of something that hasn't happened yet, and probably won't. And the part that genuinely disturbs you, the part you haven't said out loud, is that you're aware of how little you have to work with, and it doesn't seem to matter. The obsession isn't running on information. It's running on something else entirely. You've probably explained it to yourself as connection, as intuition, as knowing. Some people you just feel immediately, and this is one of them. And that intensity must mean something real is here. That explanation is comfortable. It also isn't quite accurate. What's actually happening has less to do with them, and more to do with what your brain does when it doesn't have enough information to work with, which is that it stops waiting for data and starts manufacturing it. Think about what you know about this person, concretely. Not the feeling of them, not the potential. The actual verified facts. There are maybe 5. The rest of what exists in your head is a structure your mind built from those 5 facts, using everything it wanted to find. The laugh that seemed genuine, the one thing they said that felt unexpectedly specific. The way they responded to something you weren't sure about sharing. Your brain took those fragments and ran. It filled the empty space with a version of this person assembled almost entirely from your own imagination, and then responded to that version emotionally, physiologically, as though it were real. You're not obsessed with them. You're obsessed with who you've built them to be. Dorothy Teneff spent years in the 1970s interviewing hundreds of people about the experience of intense infatuation, what she eventually named limerence. What she found, and published in 1979, was that the obsessive quality people described wasn't produced by knowing someone well. It was produced almost precisely by not knowing them well enough. The intrusive thoughts, the emotional dependency, the constant mental return to fragments of interaction. Teneff found these were structurally dependent on uncertainty and gap. Reciprocation, when it finally came fully and clearly, often ended the intensity rather than deepening it. Because the gap closed, the imagination had nowhere left to go. That finding reframes everything about what the obsession is actually running on. The brain's reward system doesn't respond to certainty. It responds to anticipation, specifically to the possibility of reward that hasn't arrived yet. A 2005 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that early-stage romantic attraction activates dopamine-rich regions of the brain, the ventral tegmental area, the caudate nucleus, the same circuitry involved in motivation, craving, and compulsive pursuit. This is not the system that produces warmth or security. It's the system that produces wanting. And wanting, neurologically, is most intense when the outcome is uncertain. B.F. Skinner identified this in behavioral research decades before anyone applied it to attraction. Variable ratio reinforcement, reward that arrives unpredictably after an inconsistent number of attempts, produces the most resistant, compulsive behavior of any reinforcement pattern he studied. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling compulsive, the same one social media platforms are built around. And it's exactly what 4 conversations with large gaps between them produces in a brain that has already decided this person might matter. Every time they respond, the dopamine hits. Every time they don't, the system escalates its pursuit. The less predictable they are, the harder the loop runs. You are not obsessing because they're exceptional. You're obsessing because they're inconsistent. And your brain was built to chase exactly that. Here is where it goes deeper. Because the people most likely to build full emotional structures out of almost nothing aren't doing it randomly. Attachment research going back to John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth's work in the 1950s through the 1970s established that the way people learn to seek connection in childhood becomes the template the adult nervous system uses for relationships. People who grew up with caregiving that was warm but unpredictable. Present sometimes, absent other times, never fully reliable. Developed nervous systems that learn to stay hypervigilant about connection. To monitor constantly. To read fragments for meaning. To fill gaps with anticipation rather than waiting for evidence. They learned that love was something you tracked, something you worked to locate, something that required you to always be paying attention because it could shift without warning. That nervous system doesn't retire when you grow up. It finds the same dynamics in adult relationships and recognizes them. Not as familiar in a comfortable way, as familiar in an activating way. The person who responds sometimes and not others, who gave you that one long conversation and then went quiet, who makes you feel like you almost have something but never quite does. Your system doesn't read that as a red flag. It reads it as home. The obsession spreads past that one person eventually. Because what your brain has learned is not that this specific person is worth pursuing. It's that this specific pattern of uncertainty is what attention feels like, what potential feels like. And so the next person who produces the same pattern will produce the same intensity, and the one after that, and the structure keeps rebuilding itself around whoever is currently filling the gap. You're not choosing people who make you obsessive. You're recognizing a feeling your nervous system already knows how to have, and following it. A 2021 study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that increased social media use correlates with higher romantic idealization and more rumination about people with whom you've had minimal real interaction. The platforms amplify exactly the conditions that produce this. Frequent exposure, personal storytelling, intermittent response, the ability to observe someone without them observing you back. You can spend 3 weeks building an emotional relationship with someone's curated output and call it knowing them. The brain doesn't distinguish well between those two things. It responds to presence, to pattern, to the accumulating sense of a person. And it can construct all of that from a grid of photos and a handful of captions if you give it enough time. The obsession always feels like it's about the person, the specific laugh, the specific thing they said, the specific way this one feels different from others. And some of that is real. There is always a real person somewhere at the center of it. But the intensity, the sleeplessness, the loop that won't stop running, that part belongs to you. It was yours before they arrived. The uncertainty they provided just gave it somewhere to go, which means the question was never really about them. It was always about what your brain learned to do with a gap, and whether you're willing to stop filling it before you actually know what's there.